Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to this Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We are well into the month of September. Today is the 8th day of September in the year 2014. It is our first program of what we hope will be a 3-program week. And it is a pleasure to be with you. It's been a while since we were together. I believe a week ago, tomorrow actually, was the last program that we did. We ran into some difficulties on Wednesday and couldn't produce the program as scheduled. And so we're here on this Monday. We're getting started a little bit late today, but that's just something we couldn't avoid. So we're at 14 minutes after the hour, so we're not too long into our program. We haven't lost that much time today. And tomorrow, I remind you, we will have our abbreviated program. We will not begin until 1:30 p.m. in the East, and our program will be 90 minutes rather than the usual 120 minutes, or in today's case 105 minutes. But that's okay. What's a few minutes among friends? It is a pleasure to be with you today after so long a time that we've been apart. I would like to make you aware of the phone number that we have put aside just for you to be able to get on the air and express your thoughts and ideas, considerations, concerns, hopes, optimism, whatever it might be related to the programming here at the Virtual Center. The phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. My email address, if you'd like to contact me directly via email, I would love to hear from you, and I will make every effort to respond to your email in rapid time. I don't like to sit on these things at all. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. In fact, the first item that I would like to share with you today is the result of an email that I received during the period since we've been last on. It was a wonderful email from a listener named Mike, and Mike alerted me to a paragraph on James Madison's position on war. And it's one that struck him as one that I might be interested in, which indeed I am. And he was particularly interested in it as well. It does relate to the programs that we were looking at. It does relate to the long letter on projected population increases within the United States that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks of programming here at the Virtual Center. And it's a paragraph that I hadn't seen before. It's not that it's not relatively available. I just hadn't had occasion to see this particular paragraph. I wanted to share it with you because I think it's relevant. It's a very significant and not very lengthy piece of writing on Madison's part. But I do want to begin by sharing with you a few of the things that I told Mike in the email that I sent him, thanking him for his email and his comments, and for sending me this particular Madison piece. And I wanted to share those thoughts with you, the audience here at the Virtual Center as well, because I think what I had to say to Mike is relevant not just to him, but to everybody, and it relates specifically to the Madison quote that he sent me. Before I do that, let me just make a very quick comment in apologies. I seem to be getting one of those 2 or 3 times a year congestion issues that I seem susceptible to. I seem to get congestion, and I developed this incurable habit to cough, especially when I'm speaking. It makes it very, very embarrassing and very, very difficult. And I want to apologize in advance should you be disturbed by this constant hacking and coughing on my part. I have a silent button here, an off button that I can push if I can catch it in time. But in case I don't, if you hear a long hiatus, it's probably because I've turned the audio off while I cough or sip coffee. And part of the sipping coffee is to hopefully cough a little bit less. But it seems like 3 or 4 times a year I get one of these things, and it just gets worse and worse to the point that I have to go to the doctor and get some sort of an antibiotic to lick it, because it gets to the point where I can't even do a program because I cough so frequently. But I just want you to know that I want to apologize in advance, and I really hope that this particular feature of my present situation doesn't interfere with the quality of the program, because I really believe that we've got some really neat stuff here that we'll be looking at least today and tomorrow here at the Virtual Center. So first of all, let me share with you just briefly a couple of the comments that I made to Mike when he sent me this Madison quote. First of all, I thanked him, obviously. But more important, I made the comment that, from the Madison that I've read, in looking at his papers and his various documents, his journals, his memoirs, and various other things, the document read clearly, it sounded like James Madison. The use of the language, the sentence structure, and all of it seemed to be quite valid. And the only point that I made to Mike, and the point that I want to make here now, is that we have to be particularly careful. And again, I'm not questioning the validity of this particular Madison quote. What I was telling Mike is that before we went further with it, I'd like to look it up and document it and make sure that it indeed is not only what Madison wrote, but written in the way that Madison initially wrote it. And the reason I say that is because I think over the time that we've been here at the Virtual Center, which is now in excess of a year and a half of programming, one of the things we've seen more often than I'd like to believe is that we live in an age where people are not above creating historical sources when they don't seem to exist, or they can't lay their finger on a particular document that they want. This relates directly to the whole idea of trying to use history in order to defend a particular political agenda or point of view by cherry-picking the evidence, the past, and finding relevant quotes or sentences, and, if necessary, taking them out of context in order to support the particular point of view that you want to make, even if the person who initially wrote the original author of the document, wrote it in a way which didn't support what you were about at all. In other words, by taking it out of context, you can sometimes totally reverse the meaning of the original author. I think we've seen that. I remember not too long ago, we saw that specifically with an article in the Washington Post written by, talk about a senior moment here. I'm trying to remember the author of the article. Anyway, it was George Will. George Will. And we remember that George Will had included a sentence from James Madison's Federalist number 85, in which it appeared, Hamilton. I think I said Madison. From Hamilton's Federalist number 85. And the way George Will used it, it appeared that Hamilton was supporting and endorsing state power and state ability to check the power of a runaway central government. Well, when I read the article, in fact, that particular point in the article is what alerted me to reading it more carefully and looking up some of the sources. And as you know, as a result of that, we went through the entire Federalist 85 paper, the very last paper in the Federalist series. And what we concluded, obviously, is that not only didn't Hamilton say and intend to say what the point George Will was making, but in effect, Hamilton's whole paper, whole Federalist 85 paper, was designed to refute the position that George Will was taking. But by taking a particular sentence out of context, George Will was able to turn Alexander Hamilton on his head and create a situation where Hamilton seemed to be saying just the opposite of what he really meant to say, or what he originally wrote. Not only that, but we've seen too much evidence to suggest that people in today's world are much too ready to invent a source if there isn't one. Never mind taking it out of context, or never mind changing a few words here and there in order to change the meaning. We've seen evidences where some people have just created a source in order to back up and basically attributed it to a historical figure, usually one of the Founding Fathers, in order to try to enlist the Founding Fathers in support of ideas, positions, attitudes, and ideologies that the Founding Fathers, or the particular one cited, didn't support at all. So what I was trying to do in an email was just alert Mike that I appreciated the Madison quote that he sent me, but that before we pursued it any further, I'd like to validate it. And I'd like you to know that I did. And I was so excited because it's really interesting. If you go on Google and you basically Google in James Madison on war, this paragraph is the very first item that will come up. And if you look at the source, you will find that Madison wrote this in 1795 in a document he wrote called Political Observations. At the time Madison wrote this, which was 1795, as you know, Madison was Secretary of State in the, come to think of it, he was not yet. Madison was, in 1795, he was in Congress during the Washington administration. He was orchestrating the opposition to Hamilton's financial program in 1795. The reason I say that is because in reading the document, Political Observations, that Madison wrote on April 20th, 1795, that's the date on which he penned this particular piece. It's very lengthy. I didn't print it out, I read it online. But if you printed it out, it's a document that probably would print out to somewhere between 15 and 20 pages. And what it happens to be is a detailed analysis of Madison's position on political issues of the day in 1795. It's kind of like Madison venting and reacting and clarifying his positions on some of the major issues of the day in 1795. And of course we know that at that time the principal issues that concerned Madison were the resumption of hostilities between Great Britain and France in the 1790s, which prompted President Washington to issue his neutrality proclamation in order to try to keep the brand new government of the new nation of the United States out of this world conflict for power between Great Britain and France. The other thing that was going on, of course, was the emergence of an opposition constituency within Congress and within the nation at large, which ultimately was going to rally behind the candidacy of Thomas Jefferson, and 5 years later, in 1800, is going to get Jefferson elected President of the United States, and we have the emergence of the so-called Jeffersonian Republican Party in the late 1790s. So that's the context of Madison's position paper called Political Observations. He's talking about various foreign policy options. He's talking about the idea of trying to, Hamilton's position of trying to break American dependence on British manufactured goods by using the power of the federal government to promote industry in this country, raise protective tariffs in order to protect American manufactured goods, and all the rest of the program developed by Alexander Hamilton. In addition, he's talking about his belief that America's agricultural potential can become strong enough, and this becomes the foreign policy of Thomas Jefferson once he takes over in the early 1800s. Madison is arguing that the potential capability of America's agricultural potential, productivity, is such that he sees it entirely likely that the United States could become so agriculturally powerful in the world that it would render the major nations of Europe dependent on America's agricultural products in order to survive and feed their own people. In other words, Madison's position is, if we continue to promote agriculture, what we can do is create international power and leverage that way by creating so much potential within the American agricultural community that the other nations of the world literally would be dependent upon access to our agricultural commerce. And of course, Madison's position is the other side of that coin, which is also positive, is that would make it necessary, if we were able to do that, that would make it unnecessary to promote the industry that Hamilton's promoting. Thus, we would not be faced with all the problems associated with urban growth and unemployment and a class of propertyless people in the cities, which is the hotbed of revolutions throughout the world and all of that. It's an absolutely wonderfully informative piece that Madison wrote. The particular paragraph which is Madison's position on war itself occurs about 20% of the way into that document. And I looked at it and I verified it with the document that Mike sent me, and indeed it is valid. And I read, of course, I read the entire document, so consequently what I read was that the paragraph or the sentence, 2 sentences in Madison's original following the quote seemed to be part of the whole story and probably should have been included in the citation that Mike sent me. So with that background, and the fact that it is valid, I'd like to share with you the paragraph and just spend a couple of moments on it in order to give you a feel for Madison's position on the whole issue of war as it relates to the issues that he's most concerned about, which is liberty, people's freedom. Madison says, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. Again, it's like, linguistically, it's a beautiful sentence. Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is so all-encompassing for any nation that by definition, all of the threats that are possible to public liberty are included, surface, when a nation is at war. And then he goes on to explain that. And he said, war is the parent of armies. Obviously, if you're at war, you've got to have a well-financed, well-supported, well-armed military force. So by definition, war is the parent of armies. From these, from the need for a large army, proceed debts and taxes. It becomes necessary to raise the money to outfit a large army to be successful in military combat. So consequently, Madison says, armies and debts and taxes together are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. Once the nation is at war, once it becomes necessary to outfit and arm a growing army, then the nation is much more willing to accept an increase in debt, an increase in taxes, whatever is necessary to meet the military objective. Consequently, all the things that are associated with the freedom of the people to disagree, to ask questions, to dissent, or whatever, are eliminated. We become a nation focused on only one objective, which is to win the war. And everything else must line up with that objective. And anything like individual freedom that might constitute a problem for achieving that objective is submerged or suppressed. Consequently, what we have when a nation is at war is a situation where the many are lined up in support of the few, who are calling the shots and making military strategy, making military policy and all the rest of it. Madison goes on. In war, too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied. And all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. What a beautiful, beautiful piece of writing. Let me repeat that sentence. Madison says, in addition to the things he's talked about, the fact that war is the parent of armies and thereby of debts and taxes, and thereby all the instruments necessary for bringing the many under the domination of the few. Besides that, Madison says in the next sentence, in war too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. In other words, in order to conduct a war, the commander-in-chief, so to speak, must be given his head. He must be given as much flexibility as possibly. Consequently, his power must be extended. Its influence, in other words, the power of the executive, in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied. There's much more of an inclination to give the executive whatever he wants in terms of appointments, and whatever those appointments might cost, whatever kinds of honors must be distributed to people in order to win their support. All of those things are allowed. The executive branch is almost given unchecked power at a time of war. Consequently, all the means, in addition, all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of government. Not only in order to conduct war is it necessary to marshal the nation in support of the war effort, but it also becomes necessary to seduce the minds of the general population, to propagandize them or brainwash them into support for the particular objectives of the war, which usually means painting an extreme picture of the threat to the nation and the danger of the enemy at hand. Consequently, people's ability to see clearly and people's willingness to ask questions are much more difficult to defend in a time of war than in a time of peace. Consequently, what Madison is saying here in this document is that all the things that we associate with individual freedom and accountability of government in a republic must be put on the shelf when the nation is at war. And history proves this, Madison implies. Madison goes on and says, the same malignant aspect of republicanism may be traced in the inequality of fortunes and the opportunities for fraud growing out of a state of war, and in the degeneracy of manners and morals engendered by both. Another consequence of a nation at war. The same malignant aspect of republicanism may be traced in the inequality of fortunes. Some people get rich during war. We know that. Madison is saying it's part of the game. It's part of what war is about. It creates opportunities for fraud growing out of the state of war, and also results in the degeneracy of manners and morals engendered by both, namely the inequality of fortunes and the opportunities for fraud. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. Madison's conclusion in this particular quote sent to me by Mike is that no nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. If the nation remains in a state of warfare for any length of time, then all the freedoms, all the checks, the separation of powers, checks of one branch of government on the other, all of those things, as well as fraud, opportunities to make money quickly, and a decline in the manners and morals of the nation in pursuit of the war effort, all of those things disappear. So if the war isn't brought to an end quickly, then the remnants of war, even after it's over, become worse for the nation than the threat of the enemy itself during the war. And here are the two sentences that I added, which seem to be related to Madison's thinking on this particular subject. This is the next paragraph. Those truths are well established, he said. In other words, what Madison is saying is these truths about war are what Jefferson referred to in the Declaration, self-evident truths. I think Madison is implying all of us can see that this makes perfect sense. They, meaning these truths, they are read in every page which records the progression from a less arbitrary to a more arbitrary government, or the transition from a popular government to an aristocracy or a monarchy. Oh my heavens. Madison is saying that throughout history, every example of a situation that leads from a government that is less arbitrary in terms of the way it deals with its own people to more arbitrary. Every instance of a situation where government transitions from popular government either into an aristocracy or a monarchy, either into a government run by the few or a government run by only one person, which is the monarchy. In every one of those cases, Madison is saying, history tells us that all of them are the product of war and the ingredients which happen because of war. This is a powerful, powerful piece of American history. I think it says a lot. I think it says a lot about Madison and not only his ability to think this through and understand the ramifications of this particular subject, but it is written in such a way that is absolutely beautiful. I can tell you that the class that I've talked about here at the Virtual Center that I'm hoping to be able to do for high school students is scheduled to begin next week. Just prior to coming on the air today, I put together an email to the cooperating teachers who will be working with me on this course. I have a teacher in each of the area high schools that will be teaching their own particular students in their own particular building as part of this course over the next year. And as I've mentioned in the past, and I won't go through all the details again, but it is a course where I am not planning to use a textbook at all. Rather, it will be basically nothing but primary documents and students developing ability to be able to handle these primary documents, to be able to read well, read better than they currently read, and be able to put together argumentative positions, interpretive positions, as a result of being able to read more critically, so that they'll be able to write much more effectively. And my plans are, and I'm scheduled to meet with, I hope I am, that's what the email says, I'm scheduled to meet with the teachers later this week. My point is that I plan to use this particular document by James Madison on war. It's short, it's brief, it wouldn't take a whole lot of time. In other words, students writing a position paper on this particular document wouldn't turn into a 4 or 5 page piece of reading for our teachers. It'd be something that they could write up in a page, in a typed page, I think, and do a good job with it. But this is the kind of thing that I want to do in this course. In other words, I want to take short paragraphs that are very substantive and have a lot to say and ask students to do critical interpretive reading and writing of these documents. And then as we work our way through the documents, we'll be working our way through the founding. That's what my plans are. And I thank Mike so much for sending me this source, because not only is it very valuable for all of us here at the Virtual Center to know about, but I think it's going to be something that I'll be able to use with high school students as well, because it's short enough, yet substantive enough to be well worth a time. There's no question. I've just spent 45 minutes, 40 minutes or so on this particular document. So there's no reason to believe that each of our teachers couldn't take this particular document and spend an entire 75-minute class, an hour and 15-minute class with high school students going over this document. Or giving this document to students one week and asking them to come in with a written analytical piece on it the following week. And then spending the next week in class going over it and then assigning a document for the following week after that. That's the goal that I have with this course, is to progressively increase the depth and the complexity of the issues and the themes that students are forced to master. The result being that as we move towards the second half of the year and the second half of the class, students will be much more adept at reading critically. They'll be able to be much better able to evaluate sources they find on the internet, to learn how to look up their authenticity, which I had to do with this document. And I just think it's fantastic. And the last comment that I would make on this particular issue, actually it's not the last comment, it's because this document leads directly into what I'd like to do for the rest of our program today. But the last comment related to the document itself is that in order to check the authenticity of this, I was able to go to the Rotunda site, University of Virginia's Rotunda website. The Rotunda website contains all the historical material related to the founding. The letters of Madison, Jefferson, Washington, Hamilton, Patrick Henry, etc., as well as the documents and by documents I mean letters, speeches, journal entries, pieces of legislation, all of the material related to the drafting of and ratification of the Constitution of the United States under the Federal Ratification of the Constitution project housed at the University of Wisconsin. This is one of the Rotunda, access to Rotunda is one of the benefits that came out of this history grant that we had for a number of years ago. I was able to use grant money to purchase lifetime access to Rotunda for all of those students at Concord University here in southern West Virginia. The only requirement for access to Rotunda, permanent access to Rotunda, is the possession of an email address at Concord University. Anybody can get into the Rotunda site through the University of Virginia, but the last time I did that, you were limited to 48 hours. I think you can get in there for like 2 days, and you can plow around, look at what's there and all of that. But your access ends in 48 hours unless you pay some sort of an access fee, and that's what I was able to do with the history grant. So again, I think Rotunda I'm just blessed by it. I couldn't do this program here at the Virtual Center without access to Rotunda, because everything I run across, I basically go back and look up the original source and make sure that it's valid. And it's just wonderful because it's getting me into the sources all the time. Let me go back to the last sentence of this particular piece by Madison. And the reason I say that is because it relates directly to what we were doing here at the Virtual Center last week when we were looking at the issue of civil disturbance as a motivating factor in the drafting and ratification of the Constitution of the United States. Be more specific. You'll remember that, about 2 or 3 programs ago, when we were talking about the issue of internal discord, civil war, if you want to call it that, as a factor at the Constitutional Convention, we looked at several quotations from the Constitutional Convention of speeches delivered by delegates to that convention. More specifically, we looked at portions, excerpts of speeches delivered by Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, Gouverneur Morris, Patrick Henry, Hugh Williamson of North Carolina, and of course, and I believe I mentioned him, Alexander Hamilton. There's no question that there was a general sense among the delegates at the Constitutional Convention that the republic that was being created at the Constitutional Convention would be most likely temporary. That at some point in time, the growing population of the United States, especially the growing urban population of the United States, would create a situation where you would have a large population of landed people living in urban America that would be dependent on a shrinking but at the same time more productive agricultural component. In other words, through the application of scientific methods to farming, crop rotations and all the rest of it, and cross-breeding, cross-fertilizing of particular seeds and plants and all of the rest of it, that Madison realized that in the piece that we've been looking at that he wrote in 1829, Madison realized that for quite a while into the future, we were going to be able to sustain republicanism in America because of the availability of arable land. There was so much land available, hundreds of millions of acres in the United States, as a result of the Monroe Doctrine, the Louisiana Purchase, and many of the other things, other successful negotiations that government was able to institute, that Madison recognized that with luck, even though population was projected to grow exponentially in America, it was going to be possible to sustain Republican government in America for at least another century because the availability of land would guarantee that the yeoman farmer would remain the rule rather than the exception in America. As long as there was land available, there was security and stability guaranteed for the nation based on this idea of stake in society, that if there was enough property for everybody who wanted it and was willing to work it, then what you would do would be you would be able to support a landed constituency of independent farmers that would forever support the stability and security that came with Republican government in America. But as we know from the Madison letter we've been looking at, Madison believed that once you got beyond a century, and his his target was the 1930s, which just so happened to be the Great Depression and the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Madison believed what many speakers at the convention spoke to was that at some point in time it would be necessary to abandon republicanism in this country and move towards something like aristocracy or monarchy. Or, God forbid, Hamilton said, the idea of a strong military force. Because once you got this large group of landless people without property who didn't have the means to acquire property because of the wage scale that seemed to be associated with economic development, with capitalism as a concept, it would be necessary at some point, in order to create stability and unity in America, to preserve law and order and internal peace, to change the nature of government into aristocracy or monarchy on the one hand, or even worse, a strong autocracy supported by the military on the other. That's what basically we've been talking about. And in order to support that, we looked at quotations from a number of speakers at the Constitutional Convention. Again, Hugh Williamson, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams wasn't there, but John Adams, in his 3-volume History of Governments, Republican governments in the world, Adams basically stated the same thing. And Patrick Henry, that were basically saying things. At one point in time, they were saying, we're going to have to go to a monarchy. Let's face it. And to be honest with you, that's the position that Hamilton is taking in Federalist Paper number 9. When Hamilton is talking about the idea of majority faction, the idea that it's going to be necessary in order to control an ever-developing, growing majority faction of poor people, it's going to be necessary to make the kinds of changes in government called for in order to control that emerging constituency. In Federalist number 10, Madison came up with a strategy where he believed with the Constitution that if you wrote the Constitution correctly and you established the principle of checks and balance, internal checks and balances within the system itself could preserve stability by making it impossible for the majority faction to organize. But even Madison believed that that was limited and that at some point in time you were going to have to move to something stronger in the area of government. In Federalist number 9, Hamilton said, and I've read this before, but I think it's worth reading again because it makes the point. Hamilton said, a firm union will be of the utmost moment to the peace and liberty of the states as a barrier against domestic faction and insurrection. In Federalist number 9, as we know, Hamilton is defending ratification of the Constitution in the state of New York by suggesting to the people of New York that ratification of the Constitution will create the kind of a firm union which will be vital as a barrier against domestic faction and insurrection in America, which Hamilton believed is a sure thing. It's going to happen. He said, it is impossible to read the history of the petty republics of Greece and Italy without feeling sensations of horror and disgust at the distractions with which they were continually agitated, and at the rapid succession of revolutions by which they were kept in a state of perpetual vibration between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. Perpetual vibration between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy, Hamilton said. If they exhibit occasional calms, These only serve as short-lived contrast to the furious storms that are to succeed. Hamilton is saying that the idea of domestic faction and insurrection in every nation is a sure thing. It's a guarantee. And that's why he's saying we need this firm union that the Constitution promises to give us. You remember at the Constitutional Convention, to that audience, Hamilton was saying the Virginia Plan, as currently organized that the convention was looking at during the convention itself, the Virginia Plan would be inadequate. Now that the Constitution has come out of the Congress, Hamilton is saying we got to ratify it because it's the only chance we've got. Hamilton goes on to say, if now and then intervals of felicity open to view, we behold them with a mixture of regret arising from the reflection that the pleasing scenes before us are soon to be overwhelmed by the tempestuous waves of sedition and party rage. In other words, Hamilton is saying, if things need to be peaceful now, be aware they're short-lived. They're not going to last. If momentary rays of glory break forth from the gloom, Hamilton says, while they dazzle us with a transient and fleeting brilliancy, they at the same time admonish us to lament that the vices of government should pervert the direction and tarnish the luster of those bright talents and exalted endowments for which the favored soils that produce them have been so justly celebrated. Whatever short-term peace and calm that we have, Madison said, is going to be temporary, and we need to realize that. He says, from the disorders that disfigure the annals of those republics, the advocates of despotism have drawn their arguments, not only against the forms of republican government, but against the very principles of civil liberty. It's because of this history of what's happened to republics in the past that those who advocate super strong governments, despotic governments, have drawn their arguments. What they're saying is, just look at the past. A republic can't work, is what they're saying, Hamilton says. Excuse me. They have decried all free government as inconsistent with the order of society and have indulged themselves in malicious exaltation over its friends and partisans. Happily for mankind, stupendous fabrics reared on the basis of liberty, which have flourished for ages, have in a few glorious instances refuted their gloomy sophisms. In other words, we've made some advances in the way we organize republican government, but Madison wants to reassure us in Federalist number 9 that these are always temporary. They can't last. In the class that I'm teaching, I was in class this morning, we're going through the colonial period. We just began the class 2 weeks ago. We're looking at the colonial period, and there in our textbook, in one sentence, in the 1760s, this is, again, 10 years before the Declaration of Independence, we see evidence in colonial America of internal discord, exactly the kinds of things that Hamilton is predicting. Examples of domestic faction and insurrection. We know that Shays' rebellion was an example of just that, just prior to the convening of the Constitutional Convention. Shays' rebellion was in September-October of 1786. The Constitutional Convention was scheduled to open in May of 1787. And there's no question that the fears generated by Shays' rebellion prompted many states to send delegates to Philadelphia that most likely had not intended prior to Shays' rebellion to even have any representation at the Constitutional Convention. What that means is, and we'll take a break right after I make this particular point. Seems to be a good place to stop. What that means is that the threat of domestic faction and insurrection in America, as reflected in Shays' Rebellion, is what forced states to send delegates to the Philadelphia Convention even if they didn't want to do it. That fact, coupled with the statements within the convention of the Williamsons and the Hamiltons and the Benjamin Franklins and all the rest of it about at some point in time we're going to have to move toward monarchy. When you add all of that together, you begin to see wherein Hamilton is making these dire predictions. You begin to see why Madison predicted in that very, very substantive piece that we've been looking at over the last week or so, that he wrote at the age of 79 years old in 1829, where his ideas as to what the threat of the projected increase in populations was all about. He, too, was recognizing that history tells us that the Constitution gives us a great shot at preserving a republic for quite a while. But even he recognizes that the life of Republican government in America is limited because republicanism itself breeds and foments the kind of internal insurrection which is going to force us to make change if we want to preserve internal order and stability. This is unbelievable stuff. And the reference that I made a moment ago to the class I'm teaching points out that in the 1760s, in Pennsylvania, in 1764, we had the march of the so-called Paxton Boys on Philadelphia, that the citizens, the small farmers and residents of western Pennsylvania who are confronted in the West with what they believe is unfair, overburdening taxation and an Indian threat that the government in Philadelphia doesn't seem willing to do anything about, that particular situation is subjecting the people who live in the West to incredible risk and vulnerability to Indian attack, to overtaxation, to the loss of their property. In other words, the same kind of thing that in 1786 is going to lead to Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. Pennsylvania experiences exactly the same thing in 1764. Finally, the farmers take up arms and march under the heading of the banner of the so-called Paxton Boys, march on Philadelphia with threats to capture the state legislature, the colonial legislature, and burn down the Capitol. And it's only Benjamin Franklin who is willing to go out and meet these people halfway and make the kind of compromises that are motivating them. Franklin is able to talk them into going back home and putting down their arms. 2 years later, in 1766, exactly the same kind of situation happens in North Carolina in what is called the Regulator Movement. And the next year, in South Carolina, the Regulator Movement breaks out again. Paxton Boys, Regulator Movement, Shays' Rebellion. It doesn't matter what you call it. What the nation is experiencing is example after example of internal discord, insurrection, and the threat of civil war. I think it's important to realize that prior to the Declaration of Independence, the Paxton Boys and the Regulator Movement, none of the opposition was aimed at Britain. Britain wasn't the problem. It was the power structure in the eastern part of the colony that controlled colonial government. In other words, these were internal disputes between the poor majority, the poor overtaxed, deeply in debt majority, and the colonial power structure in the state capital. While Franklin was able to go out and negotiate with the Paxton boys and persuade them to go home, no such compromise happened in North Carolina. In 1771, Governor Tryon, William Tryon, called out the state militia in North Carolina, marched it into western North Carolina, and slaughtered the regulators at the Battle of Alamance Creek. If you drive into western Pennsylvania now, you will find the Alamance River, and you'll be able to go to the site where the Battle of Alamance Creek happened, where the regulators were crushed. Very same thing happened in South Carolina as well. The point I'm trying to make is that the evidence from America itself prior to 1776 and again after 1776 seemed to validate the predictions of Hamilton and Madison and the rest of them about the inevitability of internal insurrection and the inevitability of the transition away from Republican government towards something quite stronger. The only difference was how long it would take before it happened. I would suggest to you that when Madison closes his 1795 piece on war, he's able to say with some validity that there's all sorts of evidence throughout history, every page which records the progression from less arbitrary to more arbitrary government, or the transition from popular government to aristocracy or monarchy, validates the truths of what he's saying about war and what it does to people's liberties on the one hand, and the need for a stronger executive and a stronger government on the other. There's absolutely, it seems to me, there's so much evidence to validate this particular theme, this particular way of looking at the past, that we cannot believe that the threat of internal insurrection and civil war was not always on the table at the Constitutional Convention, and much of what ends up in the Constitution is there because of this assumption of inevitability. I think all of us need to take it seriously. We're at 11 minutes after the hour. We're in our second hour. Let's pause and just take 2 or 3 minute break, very short one. Then we'll come back and we'll finish our program today here at the Virtual Center. This is Bill O'Brien. After a brief break, 2 or 3 minutes, we'll be right back. Please stay with us.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. We're well into the second hour of our program here at the Virtual Center today. It's 14 minutes after the hour. We have a little bit less than 45 minutes left in today's program. Again, let me repeat the phone number and, invite you to give us a call. Should you want to make an observation or have something to add to the theme of this program, which is on internal discord and the extent to which changes in government are inevitable in order to deal with it. The phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. My email address, if you'd like to email me directly, as Mike did with that Madison quote that really formed the crux of the first hour in our program today, please feel free to email me at waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. Our theme, for those of you who have been with us, and I want to thank you for staying with us if you had, and if you're just joining us, our theme today has been the threat of internal discord, civil war in America in the colonial period and after, as a factor in the structure of the Constitution as it is organized, as it's written, and as a rationale or a reason why the Constitution was able to garner the Federalist support in state after state after state that it did. The issue, no question, was that Shays' Rebellion in the fall of 1786, late September and early October, motivated a number of states to send delegates to the Constitutional Convention that likely had no plans to attend. We need to recognize, for example, that the Annapolis Convention, which had happened earlier that same month in September of 1786 at Annapolis, only 5 states had showed up to that conference. That was the conference at which Hamilton was able to snatch victory from defeat, so to speak, and issue the call for the Constitutional Convention. So the mere fact that the states are willing to attend the convention seems to me to be an indication, and the extent to which that willingness to attend is spurred or created by Shays' Rebellion, fear of Shays' Rebellion, seems to validate the whole theme of the extent to which internal insurrection seemed to be a factor in the attendance at the convention and the drafting of the document itself. And I just quickly want to make reference to a couple of sources that we looked at last time we touched on this theme of internal insurrection a couple of weeks ago, and I just wanted to kind of refresh your memory by pointing out that there's no question that those people who believed that the need for strong government was inevitable and therefore wanted the Constitutional Convention more than anything else are more than willing to jump on Shays' Rebellion and to exaggerate the threat that it poses in order to frighten states throughout the nation to attend the convention. And one of the best examples of that is the letter that Henry Knox sends to George Washington on October 23rd, 1786, encouraging him to attend the convention because of the threat that Massachusetts has just experienced in Shays' Rebellion. Knox is telling Washington that what he calls the creed, the vision, the goal of the insurgents in Massachusetts was that all property of the United States ought to be the common property of all. In other words, what Knox is telling Washington is that the real story behind Shays' Rebellion was the desire to take property from the rich and distribute it among people, among the poor. The greatest threat to internal peace and security that the nation could possibly imagine. This would be the equivalent of socialism. This is radical stuff. And Henry Knox is intentionally frightening Washington because he recognizes that it's absolutely imperative that if this Constitutional Convention is going to be successful, Washington's got to be there. He also says that the insurgents were determined, and this is a quote from Knox, were determined to annihilate all debts, public and private, and have agrarian laws which are easily affected by the means of unfunded paper money, which shall be a tender in all cases whatever. Consequently, Knox says, what he saw coming was a formidable rebellion against reason, the principle of all government, and against the very name of liberty itself. Henry Lee, who's influenced by Knox as well, joins in He's in Congress. He writes Washington after Knox speaks with him, and writes to Washington that we are all in dire apprehension that a beginning of anarchy with all its calamities has approached, and we have no means to stop the dreadful work. No wonder Washington, in spite of his desire to stay home at Mount Vernon and tend to the farm, so to speak, is willing to up and travel all the way to the Constitutional Convention in order to meet the threat posed by Shays. Evidence of this, after Washington received Knox's letter of October 23rd, he wrote to James Madison on November 5th, quote, "We are fast verging to anarchy and confusion. What stronger evidence can be given of the want of energy in our government than these disorders in Massachusetts?" He continued, when this spirit of insurrection, I added insurrection, but that's what he's talking about. When this spirit first dawned, he continued, probably it might easily have been checked, but it is scarcely within the reach of human ken at this moment to say when, where, or how it will ever end. Washington goes on. There are combustibles in every state which a spark might set fire to. That's the frame of mind that Washington is in after receiving Knox's letter and Henry Lee's letter when he writes James Madison. And of course, it's at that point that Washington informs Madison that in spite of his reluctance to go, he feels it is absolutely vital that he attend the convention. We looked at some of the newspaper coverage of Shays' rebellion. And of course, what happens is that what's happening in Massachusetts, the most inflammatory, frightening coverage, exaggerated coverage of the disorder that seems to be underway in Massachusetts, is picked up and published throughout newspapers in the United States. In other words, the Federalists, those who are supporting the Constitutional Convention, are more than willing to pick up these articles of insurrection that are associated with Shays' rebellion, and the same frightening articles appear in newspaper after newspaper after newspaper in America. Let me give you examples of what I'm talking about. One of the letters written about the threat of internal order is one that pertains directly to Virginia, Western Virginia, where I'm sitting, namely Greenbrier County, which is the county east of the one I'm sitting in, with the county, where the county seat is Lewisburg, West Virginia. In Greenbrier County, a number of inhabitants under the leadership of Adonijah Matthews, according to this newspaper account in the Virginia Gazette in September, have marched on a court in order to try to stop the court from conducting any business at all. That particular article about the efforts of citizens of Greenbrier County to shut down courts in Virginia is printed in the Virginia Gazette. But that's just the beginning. In May it appears in the Poughkeepsie Country Journal in New York on 16th of May. On the 3rd of May, it's published in the Albany, New York newspaper. In addition, that same item was reprinted in 16 newspapers in America by the 30th of June, 1787. In other words, the same article about the disturbances in Greenbrier County, Virginia, which is now West Virginia, is reprinted in 16 different newspapers. 2 in Vermont, 1 in New Hampshire, 1 in Massachusetts, 2 in Connecticut, 2 in New York, 1 in New Jersey, 3 in Pennsylvania, 2 in Maryland, 2 in Georgia. So up and down the coast, in all 13 colonies, advocates of the supporters of the Constitutional Convention and the Constitutional itself are filling the newspapers with stories of insurrections like Shays in Virginia and other places. Let me give you another example of this. I think this is fascinating because it indicates how the media is being used in the 18th century. Let me give you yet another example. Let me just read one of the pieces, and I think you get. I read the thing about Adonijah Matthews in Greenbrier County. Let me read one of the others, and I think you get an idea of the kind of stuff that people are reading in their local newspapers. This is in Albany, New York, 3rd of May, 1787. Excuse me. By a gentleman who passed through this city on Monday last from Lake Champlain, we are informed that Daniel Shays, Luke Day, Adam Wheeler, and Eli Parsons, the principals in the late rebellion in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, were at Crown Point on the 1st of the month, collecting all the force that they could at that place. That he heard Shays and Day declare that they were then going to those parts of this state and into Vermont, which borders on Massachusetts, where their friends had embodied great numbers of men who were only waiting for their presence to commence immediate hostilities. The gentleman adds that the persons above named and those who have espoused their cause treat the proclamations which have been issued for their apprehension with the utmost contempt, and even boast that the friends of government dare not put them in execution, but we would advise them not to trust too much to their temerity, lest they have reason to repent it when it's too late. So the implication is that Daniel Shays and the other guys that led Shays' rebellion are now organizing insurrections in Vermont and several other places, including Albany, because this appears in the Albany paper. That particular item is reprinted 10 times by the 18th of June, 1787. Once in New Hampshire, twice in Massachusetts, twice in New York, twice in Pennsylvania, once in Maryland, once in Virginia, once in South Carolina. The second paragraph of that particular item appears in 17 different newspapers by the 7th of July. 2 in New Hampshire, 2 in Massachusetts, 2 in New York, 3 in Pennsylvania, 3 in Maryland, 2 in Virginia, 1 in South Carolina, and 2 in Georgia. What's the point? The point is that advocates of the Constitutional Convention are using Shays' Rebellion and the threats of it breaking out in other places in order to literally frighten the hell out of states so that they will send delegates to the upcoming convention, and that they will arrive fearing the threat of insurrections breaking out all over America. And that this frame of mind, which brings delegates to Philadelphia, explains to a degree that few people have ever been even willing to acknowledge, let alone admit, that this affects the shape, the structure, and the willingness to endorse the Constitution of the United States. The point is that it's important to recognize how much of it is valid, how much of it is exaggerated. There's no question that there was a Shays Rebellion. There's no question that there were other examples of insurrections in a number of other states. I think we made reference to these the last time we touched on this. In New Hampshire, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Virginia. And Virginia is the Adnias Matthews insurrection in Greenbrier County. There's no question that Shays-like rebellions are happening in states up and down the coast, the eastern coast of America, of North America, during this period. There's absolutely no question that the threat is real. The March of the Paxton Boys, 20 years earlier in Pennsylvania. The Regulator Movement in North Carolina and the Battle of Alamance in 1771 in North Carolina, which ended that insurrection with the arrest, slaughter, and hanging of numbers of the regulators, validates the fact that there's all sorts of substantive evidence to prove that the fears of civil war in America, the fears of the inability of Republican government to control it, rather the belief that Republican government actually helped incite it by giving people the idea that they had a right to participate in government, meant that the kind of republic that the Constitution created had to be very carefully organized and very carefully shaped in order to deal effectively with this threat. But even those who were the most supportive of the Constitution of the United States, and I'm thinking specifically of Madison and Hamilton because they were the principal authors of the Federalist Papers, even they recognized, as Madison said and as Hamilton admitted, both on the floor of the convention and in Federalist Number 9, while we have in the Constitution created a form of Republican government that we believe can withstand and can effectively handle this threat for a while, the fact of the matter is, if you project population growth out beyond 100 years, which is what Madison does in 1829, you begin to recognize that even they recognize that at some point in time it was going to be necessary to restructure government and probably abandon republicanism altogether in order to preserve the peace and stability of the United States so that it can withstand effectively the threat of civil war and insurrection. Back to Hamilton's speech of the 18th of June, 1787, on the floor of the Constitutional Convention. The speech that is written verbatim in the notes taken by Robert Yates, Alexander Hamilton's fellow delegate from the state of New York. Hamilton, on the floor of the convention on June 18th, said, "All communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born, the other the mass of the people. The voice of the people has been said to be the voice of God. And however generally this maxim has been quoted and believed, it is not true in fact," Hamilton says. "The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Give therefore to the first class, the few, a distinct permanent share in the government. They will check the unsteadiness of the second and as they cannot receive any advantage by change, they therefore will ever maintain good government. It seems to me that that speech by Alexander Hamilton on June 18th, against the background that we've been able to create today here at the Virtual Center, makes it possible to really appreciate the nature of the threat that Hamilton is talking about. The threat that all of these delegates knew. When they walked out of that convention after Hamilton finished speaking on June 18th, without comment, without any reaction, without saying a word, seemingly they did so because they recognized that Hamilton had really laid out gospel to them. Hamilton had said it like it needed to be said. Hamilton had reinforced the idea that whatever the differences we've got in this convention over slavery and the size of states and the population to be represented and how much power the president ought to have and all of that other stuff, that's really been the focus of what most students have been exposed to in their understanding of the Constitution of the United States. This is the real story, and it's never been told. And it needs to be told because it's important. In the class that I'm teaching, we are using primary documents. And we are in the colonial period, just prior to the American Revolution. We're only a little bit more than 2 weeks into the semester. One of the documents that we're looking at is a document from the mother country itself, from Great Britain, written in 1647. Again, we've been talking 1700, 1780s here. 1764, 1776, 1786 for the Shays Rebellion, 1787 for the Constitutional Convention. 130 or 40 years before this, when England is in the throes of civil war, which ultimately, as we know, is going to result 2 years later in 1649 with the beheading of Charles I and the takeover of the British government by the army under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. This is the best example of the threat of a powerful military that inspires the founders. They're students of history. They look at Great Britain, the mother country, and they realize that prior to the Glorious Revolution in the late 1600s in 1688, England is in the midst of civil war in the 1630s and 40s between the forces of Parliament and the forces of the king, over limiting the absolute power of the king. As a result of this civil war, Charles I is captured, tried, and found guilty of treason, of violating the British Constitution and exceeding his legitimate constitutional powers, and is beheaded in 1649. It's important to recognize, in the face of what the United States is dealing with in the Middle East today, namely the beheadings perpetrated by ISIS, that this inhumanity of man to man is not something that is exclusive to Muslims. We here in the West have a history of beheading and dismembering as well. We see it in colonial Massachusetts. We see it in the very famous Body of Liberties passed by the Massachusetts legislature in 1641, which established establishes the procedure for the legitimate dismembering of criminals, cutting off the hands of thieves and all the rest of it. As appalled as we are today at the behavior of ISIS in the Middle East, we must recognize that these people had good teachers, us. It's important to keep that in mind. In the struggle, which results in the military takeover of Great Britain in the 1640s, the more extreme Democrats, radicals, if you will, of this insurrection in the mother country are the so-called levelers. These are the people that history labels levelers, because these are the people who want to eliminate the inequality and the gaps between rich and poor, which to them are making British society forever unjust and unfair. The levelers are the radicals that both sides in the struggle between Parliament and the supporters of the king agree on. In other words, what makes it possible for England to return to the monarchy in 1660 under the so-called Restoration under Charles II is the realization of both sides, the landed gentry who supported the absolute power of the king and the burgeoning middle class group of merchants and businessmen and bankers and investors who support more power for Parliament. Both of them realize that the most dangerous thing to all of us are the extremes of this radical movement that was behind the Cromwellian Revolution. Consequently, they recognize the need to restore the monarchy with some sort of an agreement, of an established relationship between Parliament and the king, which would go forward and establish order in Great Britain. In other words, what they recognize is that while we squabble between ourselves over whether the king ought to have most power or whether Parliament has most power, there's a group of radical poor people, real radical people out there who don't think any of us should have that kind of power, that everybody ought to be equal. Property ought to be distributed equally among everybody. And these are the people that pose the greatest threat. These are the levelers. These are those that history refers to the levelers. In 1647, when the army took power, or wanted power, in Great Britain prior to the beheading of Charles I, the levelers presented a document to the army. And they entitled their document, "The Agreement of the People, presented to the Council of the Army." In other words, these are the people that are saying to the army, this is what we want for the people of England. This is the best statement of pure radical thought. This is what drives the fear of the majority faction in Madison and Hamilton and all of them, in Washington and everybody, is this kind of thinking. And they are suggesting, in highlighting and exaggerating the threats of Shays and all the other insurrections occurring in America, that the threat of what England experienced 100 years earlier is right there within the United States, and we better create a government that has the power to stop it. There's no better way to appreciate what the threat that these people really were afraid of was all about, then read what they stand for. And this is the agreement of the people, as written by the English levelers in 1647. Here's what they say to the people of England, to the army. Entitled, An Agreement of the People for a Form and Present Peace upon the Grounds of Common Right. And then they create the preamble. This is the context or the background of the document that they present. Let me read this paragraph. Having by our late labors and hazards made it appear to the world at how high a rate we value our just freedom, and God having so far owned our cause as to deliver the enemies thereof into our hands, they've now got Charles I as a prisoner. We do now hold ourselves bound in mutual duty to each other to take the best care we can for the future to avoid both the danger of returning to a slavish condition and the chargeable remedy of another war. Notice that they enlist God in their cause. God had so owned their cause as to deliver the enemy into their hands. The capture of Charles I to them was validation that God was on their side. And now they feel it's necessary to make their case as to what they stand for to the people of England in order to avoid both the danger of returning to the slavish condition that produced this war and in order to serve as a remedy to prevent another war. For, as it cannot be imagined that so many of our countrymen would have opposed us in this quarrel if they had understood their own good. Listen to this. It cannot be imagined that so many of our countrymen, our people, would have opposed us in this quarrel if they had understood their own good. In other words, if people knew what was best for them, they'd be on our side. So may we safely promise to ourselves that when our common rights and liberties shall be cleared, their endeavors will be disappointed that seek to make themselves our master. Once we make this case, once we let people know that if they really, really appreciated what was in their best interest, they'll support us. Once that happens, once we're able to do that, then we will no longer have to worry about our common rights and privileges falling under the control of those who would be our masters. People will appreciate finally that nobody has the right to be the master over anybody else. Since, therefore, our former oppressions and scarce yet ended troubles have been occasioned either by want of frequent national meetings in council or by rendering those meetings ineffectual, we are fully agreed and resolved to provide that hereafter our representatives be neither left to an uncertainty for the time nor made useless to the ends for which they are intended. In other words, once we do this, we'll never again have to worry about our elected representatives knowing exactly what they're supposed to do. Because never again will they be uncertain as to the positions they are supposed to take, because we'll be telling them. And then they go into the document. And we have only 10 minutes left, so we probably won't be able to get any far into this. We can pick up on this tomorrow. But let me share with you just the first couple of points that they make in this document entitled The Freedom Agreement of the People. Number one, that the people of England, being at this day very unequally distributed by counties, cities, and boroughs for the election of their deputies in Parliament, ought to be more indifferently proportioned according to the number of the inhabitants, the circumstances whereof for number, place, and manner are to be set down before the end of this present Parliament. Point number one, in other words, we are not all equally represented in Parliament because certain counties and certain cities and certain boroughs have greater representation than we have because they're smaller. So the first thing we're going to do is make sure that representation in Parliament, by the end of this Parliament, representation in future parliaments will be based on numbers. The same, all of us will, by number, will have the same access to representatives as everybody else. There'll be no more of this skewed, unfair, unequal representation in government. Second, that to prevent the inconveniences apparently arising from the long continuance of the same persons in authority, this present Parliament be dissolved upon the last day of September, which shall be in the year of our Lord, 1648. In other words, the second point of this agreement is that as of the last day of September, 1648, this Parliament is dissolved. In other words, we are going to have limited terms of office. No longer are we going to have the same people serving over and over and over again. We're going to throw all of the bums out on the last day of September next year, 1648. Third, that the people do, of course, choose themselves a parliament once in 2 years, every 2 years. And then they tell exactly when it's going to happen. On the first Thursday in every second March, every other March, on the first Thursday, after the manner as shall be prescribed before the end of this Parliament, to begin to sit upon the first Thursday in April following, at Westminster or some other place, such place, as shall be appointed from time to time. In other words, we will make sure that Parliament is re-elected every 2 years. These guys have to stand up and be accountable before the people every 2 years. And then they spell out in point number 4 the powers that Parliament will have under these reforms. First of all, they state that all future representatives of this nation, all future members of Parliament, is inferior only to theirs who choose them. In other words, there's nobody in government with more power over Parliament. Only the people have more power over Parliament. These are the political reforms that the levelers plan to implement in 1648 and do implement under Alexander Cromwell. And once they get these reforms in place, they put Charles I on trial and they behead him and appoint Oliver Cromwell as Lord Proprietor of England. But again, it's the fear of groups like this, these levelers, that caused the forces of Parliament and the supporters of the king, after 10 years of rule under Cromwell, to put aside their differences and come together in order to meet a greater threat by bringing back the monarchy. And so the two competing sides agree that the best thing for England, in order to make sure that the levelers do not get a footing in this country, is to bring back the monarchy. What are we seeing here? We are seeing an example within Great Britain itself, within the mother country itself, of the transition to absolute government in order to repress the kind of insurrection reflected by these levelers. But where does the insurrection come from? Where, what do these people stand for, these levelers who are proposing these changes in government? One of the changes is that Parliament's going to take its marching orders from the people. This is classic republicanism as defined and explained by Montesquieu. That in order to have a republic, the constituency or the land area must be small, the number of competing interest groups within it must be relatively few, and the whole idea is that the representative will take his marching orders from the will of the people he represents. The levelers are imposing this. This is the model I would suggest to you that the Articles of Confederation is built upon, is modeled upon, when it is drafted at the time of the American Revolution, 130 years later. What these levelers are most insistent upon are the rights of the people, the liberties of the people. And so what they basically are saying is that Parliament, answerable to the people, will have the powers of making war and peace, treating with other foreign countries, abolishing or establishing courts and other offices, appointing, removing, and calling to account magistrates and officers of all. In other words, Parliament will have all the powers it needs, except what is not expressly or impliedly reserved by the represented to themselves, which are the following. In other words, Parliament can do everything it needs to do. The one thing it can't do is interfere with the rights and liberties expressly reserved to the people themselves, which are as follows. And then this document lists these rights. Tomorrow in the virtual center, we'll begin 1/2 hour later at 1:30 p.m. We'll pick up with this story and we'll look at the rights that these levelers demand in 1647 in England and see how similar they become to the ingredients of our Bill of Rights 150 years later. This is the history that Madison and Hamilton cite in their support of the Constitution of the United States. You've been listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien. I want to thank you for being with us. Please be safe and enjoy your evening. We want you back with us tomorrow. Until then, thank you and be safe.